Casser-Jayne Show. Let's talk. And I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Tune into the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. Today on the show, something for political junkies who are mystified by the election of Donald Trump, and a visit with the dynamic first and only American woman ever to fill the coveted position of Editor-in-Chief of Paris Vogue, when, joining me at my table, is the author of an eye-opening read, Glass House, journalist Brian Alexander, and the always entertaining Joan Juliet Buck, the author of a scintillating new memoir, The Price of Illusion. Let's get to it. In 1947, Forbes magazine declared Lancaster, Ohio, the epitome of the all-American town. Today, it is damaged, discouraged, and fighting for its future. In Glass House, the 1% economy and the shattering of the all-American town, journalist Brian Alexander traveled back to the home of his youth, lived there, and put all that he had learned to show how seeds sown 35 years ago have sprouted to give us Trumpism, inequality, and an eroding national cohesion. At the heart of Glass House is the Anchor Hocking Glass Company, once the world's largest maker of glass tableware, now owned by the Fortune 500 company Anchor Hocking, and the base on which Lancaster's society was built. Meanwhile, Alexander goes behind the scenes, entwined with the lives of residents as they wrestle with heroin, politics, high-interest lenders, low-wage jobs, technology, and the new demands of American life. Alexander has written about American culture for decades and is a former contributing editor to Wired magazine. Let's talk. So, Brian, you grew up in Lancaster, the small town in Ohio that Forbes once called the epitome of the all-American town. And then you left. And then you went home and found the town that you loved was a shell of what it used to be. So tell us what you remember it to have been and how you see it today. And, of course, about the glass house that became the title for your book. Set us up for our conversation.
Well, the town I grew up in was very much like Leave It to Beaver. It sounds weird to say that, and when I describe it to my friends in California or New York, they actually don't believe me, but it's true. It was a town where kids like me rode our Stingray bikes all over the place, where you could go into Biter and Fleggy drugstore down on Main Street and order a cherry Coke and a pack of gum from Mr. Fleggy the druggist and ask him to put it on your mom and dad's tab, not even pay him any cash. And mind you, this is not the 1920s or the 1930s. This is the 1960s and the 1970s. It was that kind of town. It seemed like everybody knew everybody. That's not literally true, but it seemed like it. It was a very tight web of a community. And Forbes had an agenda when they discussed Lancaster as the epitome of what can happen when the free enterprise system works so well, and that was to be somewhat anti-union and anti-New Deal. But they were not wrong when they described Lancaster as this great balance between industry, executives, a working class that was not well-to-do, but were thrifty and could live in some nice homes and send kids to state colleges and so on. And civic involvement. The wives of the executives and the doctors and the lawyers and so on were very active in the town, restoring old pre-Civil War houses like General William Tecumseh Sherman's house and so on. So it was one of those communities that when people think about the stereotypical all-American town, that was Lancaster, Ohio.
At the core of Lancaster, Ohio, is a business. Tell us about what that business was.
Well, there are a number of businesses. It was not technically a company town, but there was one very large business by far that dominated the business and manufacturing scene, and that was Anchor Hocking. I'm sure many of your listeners, if they were to go into their kitchens right now, they could find a glass measuring cup or a tumbler or a lasagna glass casserole with a little anchor on the bottom. That would be Anchor Hocking, and that was made in Lancaster, Ohio. At one point, Anchor Hocking was a Fortune 500 company based in a small town, and it was the world's largest maker of glass tableware. was also the world's second largest maker of glass containers, like beer bottles and mayonnaise jars and baby food jars and so on. Anchor-hawking, all the executives lived in town. Their kids went to the same public schools as the factory workers' kids did. So you were not isolated. You were cheek by jowl with the guy maybe just down the block, the guy who ran the plant, and you may have worked in the plant, but he could be your neighbor, or he could be in the same lodge that you were in. It was that kind of place.
And what happened to that business? What happened to that town?
Well, that's what the book's about. There came to be a period in the 1980s, and it has extended to the very present moment. Anchor-hawking is still there, still making glass. And what the book describes is how what I call pirate capitalism took hold in the country. The story of Lancaster and the story of Anchor-hawking really is the story of a couple of hundred other towns all over the United States where some of these same kinds of events unfolded. We tend to want to blame imports, or we tend to want to blame offshoring, or we say, well, this is the natural evolution of industry, and we don't make buggy whips anymore, and we shouldn't be mourning the demise of the buggy whip industry. This is not that. This is a 35-year period of deliberate decision-making that is meant to reap the value out of an old line company and out of the town that hosts that company. And the result, ultimately, is you end up with a guy in the White House we've currently got.
Okay, and it's interesting to me. Let's throw out some words. Union busting, deregulation, globalism, what else? All of this kind of goes, private equity.
Yeah.
All right. So I want my listeners to understand, because, we all act as if everybody really understands us, and I frankly think people don't. I think there are a lot of...
No, they don't. That's really why I wrote the book, is people really don't understand this. They don't understand these vague forces that often operate out of the public eye and have dramatic effects on the towns where they live. That's really the reason for being for this book. The book is really a description of the erosion of the American social contract, which is a very big topic. And so what I tried to do is focus on one town and one company in that town to be an avatar for many, many towns and many companies all over the United States.
I think it's important that you brought it up, and it was my next thing that I wanted to go into, and that is the social contract, because there was an unwritten social contract at one point in the heyday of America, right after World War II, up until the time that you're talking about. And why don't you describe what we all think it was, for those who don't know what it was?
Well, it was pretty basic, it was simple. It was, you work hard and certain things will come to you. If you're a responsible citizen, you get a job, there's a pathway that you can walk. If you're good to the company will be good to you. And the whole society will be good to you. You have a place in the society. You are a valued member and a valued contributor. So you may not be the richest guy. You may be the factory worker. But that is dignified work, and you will be rewarded for that. You will be able to buy a decent house, and you will be able to send your kids to decent state universities. And you can buy a bass boat. And as time goes on, you can buy a little bit better house. You can have this kind of American life that we were all raised to believe we are entitled to, as long as we uphold our end of the social contract. Now, at the other end of the social contract were businesses and politicians and bankers and so on. And they also had duties and responsibilities. It's my argument in the book that that has been shattered, and that we expect the working class to uphold its end still, while we do not expect the same anymore from people who control what I call the financialization of the American economy. We don't expect it of our politicians anymore. We keep telling our citizens, do the right thing. Don't take drugs. Don't have babies when you're 15 years old. Raise children in two-parent families. Straighten up and fly right. But we don't seem to be saying that to people who are on the other end, or supposed to be on the other end of that contract. As a result, we get the 2008 Great Recession, we get continued misbehavior, and you get the kinds of financial maneuvering that I describe in Glass House, which leads to the destruction of companies and the erosion of towns.
So what we basically have, I think, is capitalism imploding upon itself, and a complete and utter disrespect for the worker. It's not a quid pro quo, as it might have been or used to be, sort of.
Precisely.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And believe me, I want to make clear, I'm a capitalist. I believe capitalism is a great system, but I believe we need to have capitalism with rules and regulations and responsibilities. This idea that we just let the free market run its natural course and that everybody will be happy, we've shown over and over again that that's just not true.
And the other word that comes to mind is morality. None doesn't exist among a certain class. Let's personalize the story, because the glass house is simply gut-wrenching. It is gut-wrenching to read this because of your ability to humanize the town. It reads more like a novel, I got to tell you, Brian, than it does nonfiction. And it's because of the cast of characters of the town that whose lives you share with us and they share with us, and the way that you wrote it. And I want to give you a clap on that, because it really does touch one's heart. But let's discuss some of them. And in the interest of time, let's keep them each short. But I think it's important that we talk about somebody like a Sam Solomon who came in to the town. Talk about Sam a little bit.
Sam Solomon is a very smart CEO, business executive, lots of experience. Sam comes from a family that really has its roots in the tobacco fields of North Carolina. Sam is an African-American person. His father escaped the life of a black field hand in North Carolina by joining the Air Force. And as a result, Sam got good education in base schools and eventually got his MBA from Duke University. The fact that he's African-American normally wouldn't really matter that much, except Lancaster had a reputation as being the whitest town in America. Now, that is not literally true, but people in Lancaster will still tell you that. And so here he is, a black man coming in to run the most important private company in the town. And so what does he face? And the book deals with a number of tensions, not so much racial tension as it is tensions of what he envisions for the future of the company versus what the people who hired him envision for the future of the company. He really wants to turn this place around. He sees great value. He thinks it can be a much bigger, better company, employ more people, make more products, make more profit. And so the book follows his trajectory over the course of a year.
There are other people. One who I found extraordinarily interesting was Eric Brown, who was the former deputy sheriff. Talk about Eric, because he's a golden boy, right?
Eric was the local football hero and didn't quite make it in big-time college ball, so he returns to Lancaster, ultimately becomes a police officer, and then becomes the head of a unit called the Major Crimes Unit, which is mainly deals with drug and drug-related crime, which is really most of the crime in a two-county area. Eric's a good guy. I like Eric a lot. The fact that he is a native, really woven into the fabric of the community, seems to know everybody in town. He's passionate about this town, and he feels that it's really his personal responsibility to save the town, and that's a responsibility nobody should have to bear. And I detail a little bit about some of his feelings, his emotions regarding what he sees happening in the town and the limits of his own ability to help it.
So these are real people. Horrible things are happening too. The result of what we've just spent the first 10 or 15 minutes or so talking about. We get to the opioid epidemic, heroin use. That is just everywhere these days. Talk to me.
Well, there's a link. Some people have said, well, why are you talking about drug addicts or drug dealers? And the reason is because there's a very definite link between the erosion of the social contract that we've just talked about, economic insecurity, and what one sociologist calls the diseases of despair, which I find to be a very emotive term. So what she means by that is obesity, alcoholism, drug addiction, and suicide. A report just came out today from the Centers for Disease Control regarding suicide. And in communities like Lancaster, it is on the rise and has been on the rise, especially since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. Because some of these communities have never really recovered from that, even as the rest of the country has. And so I follow a number of people who feel it's obviously a little bit about their drug addiction, their drug problems, how they cope with life, but it's really about why they're in the positions that they're in, what they see as their future, and the future of America. Really, the book is about America and whether or not these people are stuck. And in fact, they are stuck. And so I think it's important that people realize that there's a purpose for having their stories in this book, because it just doesn't pop up out of nowhere, this epidemic of heroin addiction and drug addiction. There are antecedents for this stuff.
So let me go here, all right? So this is where we are in our conversation. Currier and Ives' picturesque town, destroyed by corporate greed and more. Townspeople left to eke out a life from the scraps left by greed and deindustrialization. Drugs rampant. It took years, Brian, to get here, to this mass destruction. And the one question that I have to ask is why the residents watched this happen and seemed almost unresponsive until you wake up and you go, whoa, how did we get here? Can you explain that?
Some people in the town, a few, even as they acknowledge the problems, don't think they are there, which may sound ridiculous. But you have to understand the deep in the bone love that people have for their community, which I think is replicated in many communities. They love their town still and are civically engaged in their town. They don't understand the forces. Remember, this has been slow motion. In some respects, it's been very quick. It's been about 35 years. And so it's well within the lifetimes of many people. And many of those people grasp at straws, and one straw being Donald Trump. But it's also been a long period of time, a generation and a half, really. So if you were, let's say you were born in the 90s, you've really never known anything different than this. And also the forces are really vague. As you and I began our discussion, most people don't understand how this works. And certainly most people in Lancaster, until the book came out, didn't understand exactly what happened to this big company in the middle of their town. And so when you don't understand the forces at work, you think that maybe if you just work harder, if you just restore another building or you pave another street, that somehow it's going to get better. Or maybe if you offer a bigger tax break to a company to move into your town, that'll solve the problem. In fact, these forces come from outside of the town, and they scoop the value out. And yet a lot of this happens in secret, and people are not aware of how it all works.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a minute. Here's a question. Why do people stay?
Because they love the place. And I can see why. I love the place. You know, I haven't lived there full time in a long time, although I lived there for almost the entire year of 2015 to report the book. And look, this is the place where you go into the local Walgreens, and the 60-year-old lady who's the cashier will ask if you've got your Walgreens discount card to buy a tube of toothpaste, and you say no, and she'll go down the line of people waiting behind you to see if one of them can scan their card in to save you 50 cents on your toothpaste. And nobody minds that. It's that kind of a place.
So it's community. Yeah.
It's a beautiful place. I think some of the people in this town are some of the finest people I've ever known. And so why would you want to leave that? Now, here's another problem, and your question doesn't anger me, but the response to your question often angers me, and that is there's a group of conservatives who say, well, these people ought to get up and move. But many of those very same people have spent the last 35 years telling people in towns like Lancaster that they are the real America, that their small town values are the real values of America. They've been boosting their ego in their small towns, and now suddenly they're telling them to give up the place and move on. That I just can't tell you how much that annoys me.
Well, and let me add to that. This is all you know. Where are you going? What's out there?
3 or 4 generations of your family in this town.
Of course. I mean, I think people are really hard on these people, and unnecessarily so. Let's talk politics, my favorite subject. I was thinking when I was reading Glass House of the candidate, and listen to me, and then President Barack Obama, and the title of his books, hear me, Dreams of My Father, The Audacity of Hope, Change We Can Believe In. 8 or so years ago, this nation was on a very hopeful path. Would it be fair to say that by the time Obama left office, many Americans, the very ones that you're writing about in Glass House, were living in despair? Why was this missed by the politicians? How the hell was abject desperation, which is where these people have suffered so much? Why was it missed or ignored? You have an answer for that? And what are their feelings about that? The people you spoke with.
I've got opinions. I'm not sure I have answers.
Well, okay.
So my opinion, there's enough blame to go around. among both Republicans and Democrats. And again, this is why we are blessed with Donald Trump at the moment, because the people who live in Fairfield County, which is where Lancaster is located, voted 60-40 for Donald Trump. Look, the Republicans are a little bit obvious. I mean, they are for a lot of this financialization. But the Democrats have been themselves just a little bit sneaky. So Bill Clinton negotiates NAFTA, and we get NAFTA. And he says to the union guys in places like Lancaster who work in the plants, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. And if anybody is displaced, we're going to have all sorts of training, and you're going to do all sorts of new things, and it's going to be wonderful. None of that happened for Lancaster, Ohio, and none of that happened for the glass workers. NAFTA did, in fact, affect their livelihoods. Now, having said that, it's far from the only thing. This financial manipulation that I'm talking about was much worse than anything that came from NAFTA. Meanwhile, the Democrats became enamored, I believe, with sort of life at 35,000 feet, the Davos world, the world of Wall Street. Remember, we live in a political system now that depends entirely and is greased entirely by very large financial contributions. Where is the money? The plant workers don't have any money. We've effectively neutered unions in this country, so they have much less money to contribute to political campaigns than they used to. And so the Democrats decided that they were going to join this sort of globalized elite. And in their rush to do that, they forgot to sit down and have coffee with the guys at Plant 1 in Lancaster, Ohio. Not everybody, but many people did. That was the attraction of Bernie Sanders for some of these people. I think that's why, to this day, you will find people who they're beloved of Joe Biden because he seems to sort of get it.
He's one of them.
You know, whether
he's one of them.
He understands it.
Right.
The Republicans, of course, as we've just seen from Trump's proposed budget, they're going to hurt these people. The very people who supported them the most, they're going to hurt them. So that doesn't surprise me. But people, I think, need to realize that the Democrats lost their way. So there's enough blame to go around. Some of these problems are complicated.
They're all complicated.
Hard.
Yeah, they're all complicated. I don't think there's one easy answer, but I do think that in a broad conversation, putting it all together under one roof, as you and I are right now, I think will help a lot of people to understand what they don't understand. And I don't think that it's being covered properly by the press either. Nobody ever wants to go back and go to the small town and really do the homework. You see a little of it starting to happen, but in my opinion, not enough. I have to go here. I have to play devil's advocate in a way, because I do have to say, are these people somehow complicit because they didn't scream, rant, and rave and yell when they might have earlier on? Are they victims also? Is it right to blame the politicians and corporate greed alone? I think that we need to put it in some kind of perspective. Can we do that briefly?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to try.
That's all I can ask.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, should they have been more aggressive earlier on?
Yeah.
About what was happening?
Yeah.
Yes, hindsight being 20/20, of course they should. But I think you have to remember how I was raised in this town, and so I know how some of the thinking goes. And that is, business is our friend. And so what we need to do is give them bigger incentives, see how, and at one point, in fact, they take money from the public schools and they give it to the company that then controlled Anchor Hockey, which was a multi-billion-dollar company, which certainly did not need this extra money, but they did, just to make sure the plant would stay open. Because that's the way the system always worked. They weren't fully aware of how much the system had changed, starting with the Reagan administration. And why should we expect them to? They're not all economists. I wasn't. I mean, I like to think that I'm relatively bright, and believe me, I sit around all day and look at news because that's my job. But I was not, until working on this book, was not fully aware of how this system operated. So why should we expect other people, especially in smaller towns, to be aware of how it operates? And in fact, this system doesn't want you to be aware of how it operates. So the idea that they should have been up and screaming and yelling long ago, that puts a little bit more onus on them, I think, than we should put on them.
Okay, that's fair.
We shouldn't expect them to understand how this was operating and how it was affecting their town.
But I think it's important to raise the point because I think it puts it into the proper perspective, because there is a lot of blame out there on these folks because 61% of them voted for Donald Trump in Lancaster, I guess in Fairfield County, and people are going, they're the victims of corporate greed, and then they elect a man who's the person who...
Right. Donald Trump said he was going to burn the place down, and that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted to burn the whole thing down. Now, ultimately, it's going to be the opposite. He is catering to the very people who have damaged them. And in some cases, two of the very same personalities, Carl Icahn and a guy named Steven Feinberg of Cerberus Capital Management, both of whom played important roles in the dynamic that I describe in Glass House. They are now key advisors to Donald Trump, the very people who damaged the town.
It's utterly bizarre to me. So then the next question becomes this, because, we're all on Facebook. We all hear, everybody's conversations and everybody's stories. And one of the things that you get right now is those dumb asses, look what they've done, and blame them, the poor people who voted Trump in. And I want to talk to you about that. Not dumb people. Desperate people. I think right? Am I right?
Yeah.
And I think these are important points
to make. Imagine growing up like I grew up. Imagine that I had not left Lancaster for another career elsewhere. So I had this childhood, which quite honestly was pretty idyllic. Now, not everybody did. I don't want you to get the impression that every kid was happy. What's that Lake Wobegon? Your kids are all above average. It wasn't like that. There were problems in Lancaster and dysfunctional families in Lancaster, and always have been. But by and large, it was as I described it. So now imagine that you're me, but you never left the town, and you see this slow erosion happening, and you wake up one day, and the whole system seems to have just gone haywire, and you don't know exactly how that has happened. And here comes a guy who every outlet that you watch or listen to, mainly somebody like Fox News or Breitbart, is telling you that this is your answer. This is your answer. He is going to make it all just the way it was. And in fact, those words have been said to me by people in Lancaster. On Election Day morning, a woman called me up from Lancaster. I asked her if she had been to the polls, and she said, yeah, Trump, baby. And I said, tell me why. And she very almost sadly said, I just want it to be like it was. Because she remembers how. She's old enough to recall how it was.
But
she wants it to be like it was. And she believed Trump. Now, I think she's going to wind up very disillusioned, but I can't be mad at her for believing.
Yeah, I was going to say, so far, I don't see any of the people, even as you watch all of his shenanigans and his complete middle finger to the very people who voted him in going on. I don't see any of them recounting, their vote. That being said, we get to here. Where do we go from here, Brian? I mean, Trump is back to hope, promising to reopen mines, even though mining jobs were lost more to automation than anything else, and promising trade deals that will cause the rise in prices so that people aren't going to buy American anyway, and bringing back jobs that he's never going to be able to bring back. I mean, it's all a bunch of hocus pocus. It's malarkey. But where do we go? What happens to the future of places like Lancaster's? Where are you on hope these days?
Well, what happens to Lancaster's future is I actually think it has a chance to have a bright future. If you go to Lancaster today and you're in the middle of the town, you would say to yourself, this is kind of a handsome place. It does not look like the Bronx in 1972. All that work that was put in the 50s and 60s and 70s, restoring those old buildings and so on, those are still there. People are civically engaged in Lancaster. They realize they have problems, even though I still think there's some denial about what the problems are. And it has the advantage that a lot of worse off communities don't have of being just barely close enough to Columbus that you have now a commuter culture, which is not all positive. But there are people now who live on the edge of town in tract houses that are cheaper there than they are in Columbus, and so they commute to jobs in banking or insurance or something like that up in Columbus. They're not as involved in the town as the longtime residents are, but they are helping to keep the town alive. And the town is trying to attract business and industry. In fact, if any of your listeners are thinking about moving a business or locating a business in Central Ohio, I hope they would check out Lancaster because it certainly is very business friendly. So I think it can have a bright future, but I think it's going to go through a few more years of pain before it gets there. And it's going to have to deal with some of these social problems that it really doesn't want to fully admit that it's got, but it has them, unfortunately.
And so is our Norman Rockwell world of the American dream dead?
Yes.
I've been speaking with journalist Brian Alexander, the author of Glass House. For more information on Brian Alexander and Glass House, visit his website at brianalexander.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are journalist and author of Glass House, Brian Alexander, and the dynamic first and only American woman ever to fill the coveted position of Editor-in-Chief of Paris Vogue and author of The Price of Illusion, Joan Juliet Buck. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com.
A message from the American Podcast Council.
Hey, everybody, gather around the piano.
All right. Hey, what you listening to? Podcasts. How can I listen to podcasts?
Here, let me show you real fast.
It's easier than baking a cake.
Well, I should hope so.
Hey, you know there's nothing on earth like a genuine, bona fide, electrified three-part podcast?
Yeah.
That's right. And it seems today, in our troubled world, most people don't know what a podcast is.
No.
It's true, but you know. Got one in your ear right now.
Sure do.
So please, help me out. Show your friends and neighbors how to cast a pod.
Okay.
Then tell the world about your favorite show using hashtag tripod. That's TRYPOD with a capital T and that rhymes with P, and you know what that stands for.
Podcast.
Hashtag tripod. That's TRY pod.
Joan Juliet Buck, the only child of larger-than-life film producer Jules Buck, was born into a world of make-believe. Her childhood was a whirlwind of famous faces: John Huston, Peter O'Toole, Lauren Bacall, Federico Fellini, and many more. Ever-changing home addresses: London, Paris, Cannes, Los Angeles, and the unspoken lesson that appearances mattered more than reality. When Joan became the first and only American woman ever to fill the coveted position of Editor-in-Chief of Paris Vogue, she quickly became a force in the cult of fashion and beauty. Her job gave her the means to recreate for her aging father, now a widower, the life he'd enjoyed during his high-flying years, a splendid illusion of glamour and luxury. But such illusions cannot be sustained indefinitely, and they always come at a cost. In her new book, The Price of Illusion, Joan offers up a dazzling, compulsively readable memoir spanning 6 decades. But when Joan's fantasy life at Vogue came to an end, she had to find out who she was after all those years living in the land of make-believe. What is the price of illusion? Let's talk. What a book, girlfriend. I got to tell you what. Whoa. All right? Hear me? Whoa. This is truly so. But I got to say to you, Joan, Barbara Taylor Bradford, Danielle Steele, Judith Krantz, they got to move over because your life is like a Danielle Steele novel. I mean, this is some story. It's a gosh darn saga. I mean, it's really a great memoir. So much fun to read and so sad too, and so many emotions. So I just wanted to start by telling you that because it really did bowl me over. So here we go. How was it sitting? You're welcome. You're welcome. I don't always say that either, trust me. But what was it like sitting down and facing the whole cold, hard reality that was your life? That's got to be a tough thing to sit down and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to look at it. Talk to me.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was very lucky because when I sat down, I had nothing left to lose.
Yeah.
I didn't belong to a company. I wasn't in a relationship. I was just alone. And therefore, it was really interesting. The first draft was over 1,000 pages. I kind of wrote it like a deposition because having had this life, I wrote the book to figure out exactly what had happened and why it happened and how it happened. When I came back to America after Paris Vogue, people wanted to meet the iconic editor-in-chief of Paris Vogue, which I was not. I was a writer who spoke French, who was hired for that job, who did it for not quite 7 years. That was not my identity. All these strange things happened in my life. They were wonderful and they were awful. So I wrote the first 1,050 pages. I wrote down everything. And my editor said, whoa, cut this down. And it was extraordinary because so much of my life is gone. My parents, whom I adored, Ricky Houston, my godfather's wife, who I adored even more than my mother, the places I'd lived, the things I'd known. And there I was in my loft in New York and in this tiny little place in the country sometimes, working, writing 12, 16 hours a day, writing until 4 in the morning, getting up late, drinking my coffee, remembering to eat some food about 4 hours later. That's where the eggs come in this kind of trance of memory. And I had diaries, I had photos, I had all kinds of boxes full of little pieces of paper to remind me of stuff that I had kept all my life. But each successive draft, I was trying to hone in on what's the real story, because there's so many stories here, as my editor said. What's the story? And the more I rewrote and cut down, my rewriting was cutting down. It was like, that thing the sculptor says, I have to find the sculpture in the piece of stone.
Yeah, sure.
And I had to find the story in the mass of words. And I cut out a great many incidents, a great many friends, because they were things that didn't actually connect to the true story, which is my total devotion to my father, my blind devotion to my father, my kind of suspicion of my mother, which, turned out, anyway, that's...
Right, let's keep some secrets. Let me move on. Yeah. Let me move on with you on this, because this is something that I noticed right in the beginning. I have to, there's a lot in The Price of Illusion, as you know, having edited down, there still is this just gorgeous, well, because yours is a life well lived. Here's what I found astonishing, though. The Price of Illusion, but the very first thing that caught my eye, Joan, listen to me. You might have been living in Fantasyland, but even as a child in Paris, as you tell your story, you had this keen eye for detail about truth. That astonished me. I mean, how do you square that up with the fact that you traveled in this circle of illusion? You knew truth. Even if you played the other, your core was truth. Were you aware of that? Or are you aware of that? Or am I just telling you something you didn't know?
You're telling me something that I'm taking as the most enormous compliment.
It is. I meant it as one.
Because, well, yeah, I can hear. Because for me, in writing the book, obviously I was reliving all these things, and I had the photos and everything to help me. But I was putting together, the evidence of my eyes, of my ears, of my fingers, what I touched, what I saw, what I tasted, what I smelled. And I think that I was probably so attached to surface, the way things looked, and to the surface of things and the way they felt physically under my hands, because they were real. The things were real. Even if the Pink Marble Palace was only a rental and it wasn't even my parents paying for it, it was my grandparents. But when I touched the marble statues, they were real.
And you gleamed onto real.
My reality.
Yeah. Huh? And you glommed onto real in the rest of the crazy, I think. Fascinating.
Yes, and my relationship is always, I cook for myself. I'm very happy when I'm chopping vegetables slowly and carefully. I'm very happy when I'm washing my underwear and drying it in the sun. I don't know how to garden or at all, I can't sing, but I know how to do certain things in physical reality that absolutely ground me. And whenever there's a crisis in my life, I make a chicken soup from scratch.
A nice Jewish girl. I love it. Listen to me, your parents and your uncle, before we get into the celebrity types, you were surrounded by genes that are colorful.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, indeed. My beloved uncle.
I love that, man. Talk to me about, in short spurts, because I got a lot to ask you and time flies. But talk to me a little bit about first your mom, then your father, and if you want to throw in a little bit about the uncle, just to give us a picture of where you were coming from, because I think it's important.
Okay. My mother was a stunningly beautiful child who went on stage at the age of 9 in Chicago during the height of the Depression to feed her family. She was talented, she was beautiful, she was intelligent, and she was always one of the most beautiful women in the world. And she smiled a lot. And through the hard times, she smiled more and more. And then she developed something called trigeminal neuralgia that was a very painful condition that I decided came from all that smiling. Mm. My father was born in St. Louis. He had a perfect eye for symmetry, for detail. He became a photographer very young as a teenager. He went out to Hollywood as kind of a paparazzo working for Photoplay and Modern Screen and Esquire, and he took photographs. And he took some very important photographs in his life. He became a cameraman, a producer, And he knew reality as what he saw, but he was also exceptionally good at creating a better reality. He turned Peter O'Toole into the biggest movie star in the world because he believed in him and he knew how to do it. And when he lost everything, it broke his heart, and it also broke my heart because we were so close.
Right.
And then I tried back to him.
The other part that I do want to put in here, because I'm Jewish, and I think that you can't be, that thing that just penetrates through you, whether you want it to or you don't, you understand it, you don't, whether you practice it or you don't. There is something in that, and I related, I suspect, to a lot of the illusion that you grew up around, because I did too. And I thought to myself when I was reading it, John, it's interesting what Jewish people did in those days to create the illusion so that they could step into the other world that seems so far away.
Well, there's the wonderful thing in Hannah Arendt's The Jew is Pariah, where she's talking about how the refugees in the 30s in America pretended they'd been grander in Europe. And she tells the story of the Dachshund who says, back home, I was a Great Dane.
It's so true. It's so true, right?
And I also think there's a fundamental Jewish thing about being a wanderer. And no matter how much I attempt to put down roots here and there, I now know at my advanced stage I'm a wanderer. So I need my textiles that fold up, that can go on the floor or the wall or the furniture, and I will make my world out of the surfaces that I can apply to my environment.
So well said, and so the essence of what the story of your life is all about. You were brought up in Europe mostly, and your parents left after the crazy McCarthy thing happened in Hollywood. I find that interesting too. Bilingual, obviously. Tell us about your dad then, when he remakes himself in Europe and he comes across Peter O'Toole.
He'd had 5 difficult years in Paris, living basically in places that my mother's parents rented. And we went to London. He did a TV show called OSS. He started this movie called The Day They Robbed the Bank of England with an old friend of him. He's a writer called John Brophy. He discovered Peter O'Toole, and he did it he had ways of talking about people and things that made them sound very important. I think that was part of it. And he always said, don't run after things. Let them come to you. And he also said, when things aren't coming to you, do something for somebody else.
Interesting. Great lessons he taught you, yes?
Yes. The only job I ever really, really wanted was features editor of British Vogue. And I wanted that job so badly that I would, burst into tears. It belonged to a well-born woman called Marina Warner, who'd been to Oxford, who was English. I was none of those things. I got the job when I was 23. And once I'd gotten that job, everything else kind of happened and came to me, if you will. So that was the sum total of my ambition.
Well, that's not a bad ambition. Not everybody would have that on their radar for what they want to do with the rest of their life, if you will. So that's they gave you ambition. You could say what you wanted about your parents and their world, but driven? Did you feel driven? Did you feel you had accomplished something for them, for yourself?
I felt my father, who was born in St. Louis, valued the fact that his tiny little daughter spoke French like a native. This was probably the most important thing about me to him. And all the way through the book and all the way through my life, say it in French, honey, he would go. Say it in French. Speak French. So in some kind of terrible way, when I was offered the job of editing Paris Vogue, which I didn't particularly want, but it was an opportunity to speak French. So in a way, that was fulfilling what my father wanted for me more than what I wanted for myself.
So that's the theme. The theme is always wanting to please Daddy.
Pleasing Daddy was a very big deal. And also I trusted him completely because I could see his goodness, his generosity, and his heart. And then when he became increasingly unstable after having lost everything, and after a break-in in my parents' apartment in 1983 where he was pistol whipped.
Yeah, and let's not gloss over that. Let me stop you there. That's too important to your story.
Okay.
All right, let's go to this. Let's go from you're in Europe, now you're back in California, and your parents have this horrible thing happen. Tell us about what happened.
I was actually in Europe. My parents were living in Los Angeles, and one Sunday morning, 4 guys got into their apartment, pistol whipped my father, my mother and said, "Get your wife." My mother came out of the bedroom, and I probably can't say this, I can't repeat on the radio what word she used, but she was very graphic and got the guys out of the apartment. And as a result of this trauma, my father became, I don't want to say unhinged, my father, who'd had, during the war, when he was a cameraman on a film called Report from the Aleutians, a documentary that John Huston made when they were in the Army, one night a Kodiak bear had broken into the tent where the soldiers slept. And he had been terrified by this Kodiak bear. After the break-in, my poor father thought he was possessed by a Kodiak bear. And he had what you might call an episode. I was not there. I flew out to L.A. for my parents' wedding anniversary in January of '84. And my mother told me that my father, she told me in French because somebody was listening, so she's telling me in French, bad French, that my father thinks he's a bear, and I am not understanding what she's talking about. And there's a horrifying scene in the book that I don't even want to relive by describing it now when we get to the apartment. And I got my father to a doctor who diagnosed him as manic depressive and got him on lithium. And then I had to write a great many more magazine articles to take care of my parents for the next few years.
So, for a girl who has her father on this extraordinary pedestal, which I can really relate to have him come down and fall down does what to you, Joan?
It makes you, from even before this horrible moment, from the time that my father lost his money, his status, his partnership with O'Toole, which was in the mid-'70s, I had only one thing in my head, was I wanted to give it back to him. I wanted to restore what he had lost. And I couldn't do it until I was the editor-in-chief of French Vogue, so therefore doing what he wanted me to do, rather than, I had wanted really to go up to Hot Springs, Arkansas and live on Bathhouse Row and try and write a third novel, but I took this job because it seemed silly not to take it, and Dad really wanted me to do it. So here I am, I'm editing French Vogue, Paris Vogue, I'm in Paris, there are expenses, I'm giving lovely parties, I'm wearing nice clothes, all the famous, wonderful, glossy people are coming to my parties, and my father, now a widower, is making bad left turns in the Subaru on Wilshire Boulevard. And I think this is not possible. I cannot let this happen. I brought my father to Paris. For 6 months he lived with me. That was not a good idea. I got him a beautiful apartment overlooking the stamp market, just by the rond-point of the Champs-Élysées, beautiful looking south towards the Grand Palais. I hired an Indian woman called Anita to spend her days with him and have lunch with him and take him to the dentist and the museums and listen to his stories. And when he would come to my dinner parties, which Anita cooked for, he was treated like a king. He was treated like the important person he had once been. So my job at Vogue was able to create the illusion that he'd gotten back everything he had lost.
Great. So let's not stay all in the heavy. Darling.
No, please, let's lighten it up right now.
We're going to lighten it up right now, okay? Men. Let's talk men. I love to talk about men. You've had your fair share. You did marry, you've been divorced. Journalist John Halpern. But here are some names, some of them we may share, but I'm not going to tell you who have been in our lives.
Wahoo!
Okay, honey? But I'm not going there. It's going to be a secret.
Oh, so I have to go there and you don't.
Right. Exactly. That's the way that one goes. All right. Donald Sutherland, Jerry Brown, Brian De Palma. You kissed. Do tell, darling. What was these men? I mean, these were pretty extraordinary men that circled around you, but I know Sutherland was pretty important to you. Talk to me.
What's interesting to me about a man is what's inside his head and how he sees the world and what interests him, much more than, who he is. It's like what's inside the man's head. So these happen to be a few of the men that I have been involved with. each of whom had a very different view of the world and a very consistent view of the world, each of whom intrigued me for a different reason.
Okay. What, not the number one thing in your life, though? Men?
Well, I would fall in love with the man and the way the man was and what the man was interested. When I was in love with Jerry Brown, I set off to write an essay that took me 9 months about the right to the pursuit of happiness, because it was a question he kept asking. What is the right to the pursuit of happiness? So I went off and wrote this essay inspired by him. It was the inspiration of him more than the reality, in fact. And each of those men inspired me in a different way. There's a piece in Harper's Bazaar this month. They asked me to write about the men in my life, my rocky, my what was the word, tumultuous love life. And I sat down in a friend's patio in Barcelona in December to write this. And the book, I started writing it, but what I love about doing these essays for Harper's Bazaar is I let them take me where they want to go, where the essay wants to go. Leonard Cohen had died around the time of the election. We had met as a flirtation, and then he had become a very close friend. And I had seen him about a year before. I hadn't mourned him. I'd been thinking of other things. And sitting in that patio in Barcelona, I found I didn't want to write a man in my life. I wanted to write about Leonard. And I wrote this essay about him and about our friendship. That's the essay I am proudest of anything I've ever written.
Wow, that's interesting. Question.
Yeah.
Here you are, you're not old.
I'm old. No, I'm 68 years old.
Honey, you're not old, darling. You're getting there.
When I was young, I would fall hard, not only for the man, but, as I said, for everything he represented. And this would illuminate my life for the next few years. And I'm not a schemer. I'm not a manipulator. And I never sort of tried to catch anyone. I was interested in the experience of the moment and in the degree of intensity of the connection. But these were like waves of interest, waves of a kind of illumination, and then the wave would subside and it would be over, and then somebody else would come along. I am so relieved to be 68. Yes, I have been involved with various men in the last, since I've been back in America, I've been involved with 3 different men. And I think particularly since I started the book was more important to me than any man or any relationship.
Is it okay to be at this stage of your life and not be married, be living with... Do you know what I'm saying? You could ask me the same question. I'll answer if you want, but you know where I'm going.
But to be completely realistic about it, at this age, I think it would be great if I was of an emotional constitution to have withstood a long marriage. It would be very nice to be with somebody who had met me when I was young and when he was young or younger. And at this age, what one is presenting to a man that one meets. I mean, I had a date a few years ago with somebody, kind of a first date, and I walked in. It was before I'd started dyeing my hair again. He looks at me and he says, "Do you ever dye your hair?" And I thought, the truth of it all, I'm an older woman. What I'm offering is not the luscious, ripe, fabulous sexuality of a younger woman. I'm offering insight, compassion, love, companionship, humor. But the other side of it is, it's probably not as attractive. And when I say offering, I'm an only child. I've spent a lot of my life alone, just alone with the typewriter, alone with the computer. I'm not very good at relationships. My friendships are paramount to me, and some of my friends are exes, and a lot of my friends are men who have never been relationships, but with whom I have a trusting, loving, dignified, fabulous, loyal relationship that's gone on for years. That's fine, because for me to put on high heels and grow my hair long and have a manicure and do all those endless things to make my body look younger than it is, I can't do that. I've got other stuff to do. I've got stuff to write.
You fascinate me, darling. You really, really do fascinate me, because you're so the antithesis of what anybody would ever think, and that's what this great book does. I think it gives you a dimension that those of us who have followed your career would not have really known had we not read this terrific book. Listen to me.
What do you mean the antithesis?
Well, because I really was expecting far more of a non-dimensional person, more of an illusion. So there you go.
We can't be illusion,
right? But
we can't. You know, life is tough. Life is hard. Life has all kinds of weird surprises.
Absolutely.
All we can do is be kind and loving with the people we're close to, and also with strangers.
So you get down to real. I think that's the wonderful part of older. You don't give a hoot anymore. I could use other words, but you don't give a hoot anymore, and then you just get down to real. But life takes you to real, and it took you to real, which I think is right. and twice, not once. It took you twice. At the end of the Vogue thing, that was pretty awful. You wind up.
The rehab was fun. And
and probably relaxing too. I mean, let's tell that. I mean, when you got fired, or if you will, Newhouse thinks that you're addicted because you're running around drinking seawater, which I get to, and so he says, and then you're addicted, and they send you into rehab. Okay, that's the and you return to New York. What having to deal with all of this. This is what the world.
To Santa Fe.
Right, to Santa Fe. And that's what the world sees. That sees this big picture. But life goes on, and you got chutzpah, honey, and you do it over and over and over again, and you actually... Go ahead. You can take it from there. Tell us what happened next.
Well,
and we only have a few minutes, so do it quickly.
Okay. In the rehab, a jazz great, who shall remain nameless, I had a revelation, which I'm not going to explain. It's in the book. I had a big revelation about what I was addicted to. And I said, oh, now I know I'll never do that again. And this jazz great said, watch out for the relapse. The relapse is what kills you. And I said, I'm never going to relapse. My addiction, I can say it now, was to Vogue. And I started working for Vogue again after I came back. And I did whatever Vogue wanted because I wasn't going to tell them what to do because I'd been an editor-in-chief. And if I started telling them what to do, it would be bad energy. And they sent me to Syria. And I wrote this interview. I took the assignment. I wrote this interview, and it came out to universal censure. And then Vogue canceled my contract.
Well, let's say who the interview was with. It was with Bashar Assad's wife, the butcher of Syria, if you will. And
who had not started butchering anybody.
Right, and that's well put. And she is an absolutely exquisite woman, and she's the Syrian version of our Jackie Onassis kind of lady. So you just
she's British,
and you did it in at a time that it was she was a curiosity, and you got nailed for it.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, indeed. So that was the end of that. But that one knocked you. That's what got you to write the book and say, wait, stop. Yes. I got to get off the train and take a look. Right?
Yes, because I no longer belonged to anybody. I was out in the cold. I was the scapegoat, and in the book I write about the scapegoat. They didn't kill the scapegoat. They sent the scapegoat out into the desert. I went out into the scapegoat. What does the scapegoat do? Wanders through the desert. It eats some leaves off the bushes. It drinks from the streams. Maybe it finds another village. Maybe it's the new goat in the new village. Maybe it finds another goat with whom to make baby goats. And I went out. Everything that I had had around me in my life from the age of 19 was stripped away, and finally I was free of my protection that I had been attached to, that I had stayed under all my life. But I was free also to find out who I'd been, where I'd been, what it meant, and free to write my book.
You know, there are people who say reality is hell and illusion is heaven. What do you say?
Are there?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I think illusion is candy and reality is spinach. I mean, reality, it's, you can't live on candy. You'll get diabetic really fast and your teeth will fall out.
I've been speaking with Joan Juliet Buck, author of a remarkable memoir, The Price of Illusion, available at fine bookstores everywhere and online at Amazon.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec LLC. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit HalliCasserJayne.com.